I have been trying to write this story for over a year now. Maybe I'll finally go through with it. 22 years ago, I was 11 years old. Growing up, I was taught to always respect adults, especially when in someone else's home. I was the youngest of three. My dad traveled often for business, and my mom was usually busy working or driving the older two siblings to whatever they had going on. This meant I spent a lot of time in other people's homes. I was always very friendly, polite, and I enjoyed speaking to adults. I was also an extremely nervous kid, and I tried my best to hide it. My mom was very emotionally abusive to me, and I believed her when she blamed my being a horrible child for her abusive actions. Therefore, I was constantly in fear that someone would find out just how truly awful I really was. My approach to life at 11 years old was, be polite, never make waves, and don't upset Mom. It was the week of the 4th of July, and a girl that I went to school with, Leah, had invited me and another girl, Carla, over to swim in her pool and to spend the night. I had known both girls for about 5 or 6 years, but had only recently become better friends. My mom dropped me off and gave me the usual, have fun, don't embarrass me. I remember having so much fun the whole day. I was young for my grade, so while I was still 11, Leah and Carla were 12. They flirted with boys and even wore bras. I was a tomboy and I was as flat as the floor. Leah and Carla were cool though, and we had the best time together. At night, we did girly things like talk about boys and play with makeup. It was so different from my normal summer night hangouts, playing capture the flag with the neighborhood boys. The next morning, we were still giggling and having fun. Leah asked her mom if Carla and I could spend the night again, and she said yes, and we jumped around with excitement. It was the 4th of July, and Leah's dad was coming back from wherever he had been the night before, with fireworks. A bit later, Leah's dad pulled into the driveway. I had never met him before. He stepped out of the car wearing cut-off jean shorts and no shirt, smoking a cigarette. His hair was straggly and greasy. Leah said, "Hey, Dad," and he replied, "Who is this?" looking at me. I introduced myself and he walked inside. Leah's mom told us to pick things up around the house because they were having some people over. We did as she asked. I remember noticing a shift in the overall vibe in the house though. This was something that I was familiar with, as my mom could change the feeling in her house from warm and happy to ice cold and spiteful in a blink of an eye. And typically, there was some sort of yelling that accompanied the shift in my house though. It was different at Leah's, as everyone appeared to be going on as usual. A couple of hours later, we went outside with Leah's dad. He had an enormous slingshot thing that he had made in the garage, and he asked me if I wanted to see what it did. Sure. He put a potato in it and launched the thing into a field across the street. He asked if I wanted to try. Really? Yeah. I would never be allowed to do this at home, so of course I took him up on it. Leah and Carla wanted to try it too. He gave a quick, "Sure," and walked away to grab another beer. Once they were finished, he asked if I would like him to show me some cool tricks that he could do with the slingshot. He addressed me directly by name. He did not ask Leah or Carla. This felt weird, but I smiled and wanted to keep being polite, since he was an adult and I was in his home. Friends of Leah's parents started to trickle in. Leah, Carla, and I went back and forth between playing in the pool and the garage. Every time we went back to the garage, her dad would ask me lots of questions and comment on how cool I was. He asked me if I had a boyfriend yet and if I too had started wearing a bra like Leah. Leah just kind of laughed and said something like, "Stop talking about that, geez." I smiled and tried to hide how uncomfortable I felt. A few minutes later, a man arrived with his daughter. This dude was Leah's dad's best friend. Leah's dad began calling my name, motioning for me to come over. Hey dude, this is Leah's friend. She's really cool and she loves our slingshot. Leah's dad and the guy had built it together. Oh yeah, cool. Hi Leah's friend. Hi, nice to meet you. As the night continued, I felt like every time Leah, Carla, and I were near Leah's dad and the dude, they had something to ask me or tell me. Leah and Carla didn't seem to think that it was weird or even to notice, really. It was now dark and the fireworks were done, and I was really getting tired of having to engage in conversation with the two of them. They smelled like cigarettes and they had put their arms around my shoulders a couple of times. I didn't like them touching me, but I never said anything. I acted like everything was fine and I just laughed it off. I suggested that we go back to Leah's room and play this game that we had played a few times over the last couple of days. Finally, we were away from them. But then Leah's dad and the dude came into Leah's room and said that we should come outside to the bonfire for s'mores. They also had another brilliant idea for us. We could sleep in the camper tonight. Leah's family had a camper at the very end of the backyard, right next to the bonfire. Leah and Carla loved this idea, but it made me feel sick. I didn't want to spoil any fun and I didn't want to offend Leah's dad or the guy. They were adults and it was still Leah's dad's house, so I had to be nice. But all I wanted to do was run away from the both of them. We were walking out to the backyard carrying blankets and pillows, and the dude walked up to us and said his daughter wanted to join us in the camper tonight. The dude's daughter was only a year or so younger than me. She was 10, but she was smaller and acted much younger too. She was timid and quiet. When she did speak, it was almost babyish. Leah's dad and the dude were getting more drunk by the minute. After we had finished getting set up in the camper, the dude's daughter asked me to take her back to the house to go to the bathroom. I had just met her a few hours before, but she seemed to sort of cling on to me. When we were walking back to the house, it was about half a football field from the camper. She grabbed my hand while we were walking. She asked if she could sleep next to me in the camper, and I said sure. On the way back from the bathroom, the daughter took my hand again and held it tightly the entire way back as she sucked on her thumb. She clung to me and asked me again if I was going to sleep next to her. This made me even more nervous. I just wanted to run away. We all got situated in the camper and Leah, Carla, and the daughter were asleep pretty quickly. Leah's dad and the dude were joined by another guy whose voice I didn't recognize. All three were right outside of the camper sitting by the bonfire. They were drunk and loud. Something was so wrong about this situation. My heart was racing and I was praying and begging God to help me make it through the night. Suddenly they were quiet. I felt the camper moving and the door was opening. It was Leah's dad. He whispered, "Leah's friend." He used my real name though. "Leah's friend." My back was turned towards him and I pretended to be asleep. I didn't move, I didn't answer, I just waited. After a few minutes he went back outside and I heard him say, "She's asleep." The dude told him to just wake her up, tell her that we have something to show her. A few minutes later, Leah's dad returned and again started whispering my name. When he went back outside, Leah's dad told him that I wasn't waking up. The third guy told him to just shake me awake. Thankfully, I had positioned myself furthest from the door on an upper bunk with the daughter next to me. Leah and Carla happily took the bottom beds, which blocked any way of reaching me or the daughter. Leah's dad and the dude came into the camper a few more times after that, but didn't say anything, and they eventually passed out around the fire. I thought that night would never end, but eventually it did. When we finally got out of the camper, we went back to the house and I called my mom to come pick me up. It was like nothing had ever happened. I literally felt crazy the next day. I was surrounded by people yet no one noticed. I questioned myself and the entire experience for years. What if I was just being paranoid? What if I had interpreted the whole night completely wrong? Leah and I quickly drifted apart. I never went back to her house, and I never told anyone what happened that night. Over 10 years later, during a visit to my parents, my mom was going on about all the gossip that she had heard recently. I was half listening when she had mentioned, "That girl Leah from grade school, do you remember her?" Her father had been in the local paper a few months earlier. He had been arrested and charged with doing inappropriate things with a minor. Apparently, there had been other claims a couple years prior to his arrest, but nothing came of those. I had no interest in knowing anything more about him or the outcome. I knew in my heart what he and his friends had in mind that night, but I was worried about offending someone or how it would look if I had asked to leave. I didn't want Leah to be hurt or embarrassed, so I pretended to be oblivious to her dad's blatantly disgusting behavior. I still hate it when someone tries to put their arm on top of my shoulder. This happened a few years ago when I was maybe 15 or 16. I used to not have blinds or curtains on my windows, and I never bothered to get something to cover them up for a long time. My street is fairly rural and we knew all of our neighbors fairly well, so I was never really worried about something weird happening until this night. It was sometime in the winter. I have always been a night owl, so I was up late on my computer. I had the light on in my room, but it was pitch black outside, so I couldn't see anything out of the window. It was completely silent in my house when I heard it. 3 loud bangs on my window. It scared me so bad that I fell off my bed and stayed down there for a while. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was some kind of animal, like a bat or something, that flew into my window. I calmed myself down and went back to doing whatever I was doing. I didn't really think much of it after that. I never bothered to mention it to anyone, until a few nights later around the same time. I had my window cracked open, with still no blinds covering it, when I heard leaves crunching outside like someone was walking on them. They stopped right outside of my window, but it was still too dark for me to see what was out there. At this point, I probably should have screamed for my parents or called the police. I could feel someone staring directly at me, and I could feel that they had bad intentions, but I was too scared to even move. Someone was out there. And so I did the only thing that I could think of. I stared directly into the pitch blackness outside of the window, put on the most intimidating face that I could manage, and stayed like that. I must have sat in that position for 5 minutes, until I heard the footsteps again, this time leading away from my window. I shut the window and tacked a blanket around it after I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. I barely slept that night. The next day, I bought a pair of blinds and told my mom about the incident when we were at the store. I heard footsteps outside my window last night. My mom doesn't get scared or intimidated easily. She's one of the most fearless people that I know. But as soon as those words left my mouth, she turned white. "Did you tell your dad about that?" I told her no. I hadn't told my dad and asked why she wanted to know. She looked me straight in the eyes and told me one of the most bone-chilling things that I'd ever heard. "Your dad was talking to our neighbor this morning. She told me that she had seen a man walking around our yard for the past few nights. Last night, she saw him walking towards your window, but he disappeared into the dark before she could figure out if it was one of us or not. She said after a few minutes he left, but he came back a few hours later and she saw him while getting ready for work. She knew that it wasn't one of us this time since the sun was coming up, and he had a knife in his hand. She went outside and screamed for him to leave, but instead of running down the street, he ran into our backyard and into the woods. I live in a military neighborhood. All of my neighbors are active duty, which tends to make me feel pretty safe if something were to happen. But after I had just heard that there was a creepy man outside my window more than once, and he ran into our backyard instead of down the street, I don't think any amount of military would make me feel safe after that. My parents never let me stay over at my boyfriend's houses back then. But after that night, she let me stay at my boyfriend's house for almost a week. When I got back home, my blinds were installed, and there was a curtain over the window, and the window lock that was previously broken was fixed. I haven't unlocked it or opened that window since that had happened. We never saw or heard about the guy again, and my neighbor never saw anything again either. And we reported the incident but never heard anything about it after that. This happened a few years ago when I was about 15. It was a pretty common occurrence at the time for my family and the families of my two best friends to go out for dinner. During one such time, my best friends and I decided that it would be more adult and cool for us to sit away from the rest of our families and to just eat and chat at a separate table. We were a couple of young teens having a fun time, and when one of my friends, Jenny, whispered that the guy sitting at the table next to us seemed to be staring at me, I slightly turned my head and realized that he did seem to be looking my way, but I brushed it off. I mean, we were at a restaurant. People looking around seemed normal and innocent enough. As the time progressed, my other friend Gabby also noticed the man staring at me, and we began to get a little more concerned. He had seemed to have finished his food a long time ago, but just continued to sit there watching us, especially me. The man seemed to be in his 30s and his expression was starting to creep the three of us out, but we decided not to do anything in case it was just us overthinking. Eventually, the man did pay and leave and we felt relieved. But as soon as I took my first bite of food, Jenny motioned to me frantically. We were sitting by a window and as it turns out, the man had left the restaurant but he hadn't fully left the premises. He was actually standing below the window continuing to stare at me. At this point, we realized this wasn't normal behavior, but we also didn't want to alert our families and cause a scene. So we kept eating but also kept our attention on the window. By the time we were all done with dinner and our bill had been paid, the man was still outside. We were worried that he would try something, so we stayed close to our dads on the way out. He followed us as we walked to our cars from a distance, but eventually changed direction and left. The whole ordeal was super creepy to us, but we let it go because, well, it was over, so we thought. 3 months later, the three of us decided to visit the busy downtown area of our city for fun. We were standing on a street corner trying to figure out where to go next when I felt Gabby tapping my shoulder. At first, I didn't respond, but when she continued, I looked up and my heart stopped. It was the same guy from the restaurant. The restaurant had been nowhere near where we were currently standing, yet somehow by sheer coincidence we had ran into him again, in a city of huge population. The guy made eye contact with me and I could tell he recognized us. We immediately walked away as quickly as we could, and he started to follow, but after a few minutes, we eventually did lose him. We tried to then continue on with our plans and did end up having a good time, all things considered. However, just when we had decided to head back home, we ran into the guy and one of his friends again. This time, we were totally freaked out. He spotted us again, and this time, him and his friend followed us. Gabby told us maybe he wouldn't come after us if we went into a makeup store. We tried that, but nope. They walked right inside after us. At this point, Jenny was ready to call the police, but we decided to try and lose them one last time by ducking into a toy store. We stayed in the store for a while and kept an eye outside. They walked back and forth for a few minutes looking for us, but eventually they left the area and we decided now was the time to make our move and leave. This time, we had lost them for good, but the entire ordeal was beyond stressful. The three of us never told anyone else what had happened. I still don't know what he wanted from me or what would have happened if he had caught up to us, but I'm glad I haven't seen that guy since. All these years later, my friends and I think back to this incident and still think about how crazy the odds were to meet up with the same creep more than once in completely different random places.